Welcome everyone to this first online seminar hosted by the Department of the Air Force's Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. I'm Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, Editor-in-Chief of the journal and Director of the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. Before we get underway, I must provide the obligatory disclaimer that the opinions and views expressed in this presentation are solely those of the participants and should not be construed as the official position of the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Air University, U.S. Air Force Academy, the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, or other U.S. government entities. This inaugural panel is titled A Conversation with the Authors, China's Strategic Arsenal, and we are joined today by the two editors of this compiled volume, U.S. Air Force Academy professors Paul Bolt and Jim Smith, along with three of the contributing authors who Dr. Bolt will introduce to you shortly. Following the editor's introductory comments, each of the authors will present on their specific topic, after which Mr. Zhejiang, a senior writer for the consortium, will orchestrate the question and answer portion of our event, presenting the panel with questions sent in from subject matter experts and fielding additional questions from the audience, addressing the book and the theme of China 2049. Without further ado, allow me to introduce the editors of China's Strategic Arsenal. Dr. Paul J. Bolt is a professor of political science at the United States Air Force Academy. He received his bachelor's from Hope College and his master's and PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bolt is taught at Zhejiang University and Baicheng Normal College in the People's Republic of China, as well as the University of Illinois. In 2009-2010, he served as a Fulbright Scholar at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His other most recent book is the co-authored China, Russia, and 21st Century Global Geopolitics, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Dr. James M. Jim Smith is director of the Air Force Institute for National Security Studies, housed within the Department of Political Science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. On active duty, he served as an Air Force pilot and operational planner. He also served academic assignments at the Air Force Special Operations School, the Air Command and Staff College, and West Point's Department of Social Sciences, where he was also Associate Dean for Academic Research. Smith holds a bachelor's from USAFA, a master's from the University of Southern California, and a doctorate from the University of Alabama. Doctors Bolt and Smith, I hand this show over to you.
Thank you. I'll give a little background to the book. I took over INSS in 1998 and immediately added a special interest area on Northeast Asia and China as an emerging strategic power. 2001, when the majority of the security studies community focused on counterterrorism, I increased that focus to be sure that events and developments in Northeast Asia and in China would not be overlooked by the community. 2003, we convened a workshop on China's nuclear weapons and delivery system development. And it was successful enough that we determined that it should be turned into a book. I asked Paul Bolt from the faculty at the Air Force Academy and Al Wilner, an Army Foreign Area officer on the faculty at West Point, who would later become the defense attaché in Taiwan, to edit that book. And in 2006, it was published, China's Nuclear Future. We went on to sponsor 15, 17 studies on China and Northeast Asia. And we held a couple of workshops, one on extended deterrence in Northeast Asia in 2011, and then significantly in 2015, a strategic stability seminar that raised the issue of whether it was too late, according to some of the participants, to establish strategic stability with China. So that was the genesis of this particular volume, a follow-on to China's nuclear future, but expanding to China as a strategic power, not simply a nuclear power. Paul and I sat down, we came up with the concept in 2017. 2018, we brought authors together in Washington to talk through what they plan to do, the outline of their chapter, to deconflict and to make sure that there weren't a lot of gaps. And then finally in 2021, just April of this year, the book, China's Strategic Arsenal, came out from Georgetown University Press. This book presents a fairly wide, not completely comprehensive, but fairly wide view of China's strategic developments, the impetus behind them, the doctrine they indicate, the systems themselves. But it's not the answer. It provides a context, it provides a departure point for further analysis and search. And that is what today's event also represents. Updated analysis on key dimensions by three of the authors. In worldview, doctrine, and capabilities, as again, a departure point for continuing study of this dynamic field. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And thanks too to Dr. Rockwell and the Journal for Indo-Pacific Affairs for bringing us together and starting this conversation. And I'm personally really grateful for the collaboration that we can have between the Air War College and the Air Force Academy and all the other institutions that are represented here. And I just have to say that personally, I really appreciated the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and I've learned a lot from it, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future. As Jim mentioned, we're talking about a vital topic today. Since China's first test of an atomic bomb in 1964, there's been a lot of effort put into understanding both the weapons that China is developing and the way that China thinks about such weapons. So for instance, in 1964, some US government analysts believed that China's test would have limited immediate impact, while others predicted a sharp loss of US influence in Asia. And we are kind of continuing in that tradition today of thinking about how changes in China's strategic weapons and doctrine will shape American interests, strategic stability, and US influence in Asia. Of course, China's decisions on its strategic platforms and doctrines are shaped by a variety of factors, including bureaucratic politics in China, technological advances, and China's relations with the United States. When China first tested its atomic bomb in 1964, relations between China and the United States were at a low point. Nixon's visit to China in 1972 fundamentally affected that relationship, although under Xi Jinping, the rivalry between the United States and China has deepened. So today's presentation by our authors will begin with Andrew Scoble. Andrew is going to discuss China's geopolitical worldview and resulting grand strategy. Thus, Andrew is going to link Chinese leaders' conceptions of China's security with China's strategic weapons. Chris Toomey will then step in to look more specifically at China's nuclear weapon doctrine and deterrence concepts, and how those relate to China's security and China's strategic weapons. And then Brad Roberts will step in to discuss the central drivers for understanding China's path forward in light of the things that we do know about China, but also in light of the many uncertainties that still exist about its programs and its intentions. So let me introduce our first author. Andrew Scoble is a distinguished visiting fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also an adjunct professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. During 2020, he served as the Bren Chair in Non-Western Strategic Thought in the Krulak Center at Marine Corps University. Andrew earned a doctorate in political science from Columbia University. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Paul. So my task in the volume is to set the stage for what's to come, the chapters, the following subsequent chapters that are more focused on China's nuclear arsenal. So in the few minutes I have available, I want to make three points. First point is, what do we mean by China? When we use the word China or People's Republic of China, we mean, or at least I mean, a set of leaders and a system of governance, or what's often referred to as a regime. People's Republic of China is often referred to, described as a party-state. But I think this conception is an incomplete characterization. I think it's more accurate to talk about a tripartite conception. There's the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, and then the People's Republic of China, the state. So the party, the military, and the state. And of course, the party, the Communist Party will celebrate its 100th birthday next month. So it's been around for 100 years. 6 years later, officially the People's Liberation Army was established in 1927. And it wasn't until 2 decades later that the state apparatus was formally established. So when we talk about China or the regime, in my view, we're talking about 3 distinct but intertwined bureaucratic systems. So that's what we make. And the combination is a Leninist, that is a centralized, very hierarchical bureaucratic system or set of systems. So how does this party army state or party military state see the world? The leadership of this system is deeply insecure and exists in a perpetual state of insecurity. Hence, I've characterized their worldview as a nested one. What I mean by that is they try to protect the regime by establishing a set of rings or that can cocoon the regime, protect it from various threats. In my conception, there are four rings of insecurity. The first is an innermost ring constitutes the territory claimed and controlled by Beijing. Not surprisingly, this is the most important ring, and the regime is very wary about internal threats and devotes considerable resources and efforts to domestic stability maintenance. The second ring, the next ring out, encompasses China's, the People's Republic's periphery. So it's not an exact science, this is a conception, but it roughly 100 miles off the coast of eastern China, extending inland, again, roughly about 100 miles from China's border, People's Republic's border. And these, in these areas, Beijing seeks to maintain stability and either establish or nurture pro-Chinese regimes, entities, or at least keep them neutral, and definitely work to exclude outside powers from stationing or military forces or entering these areas. Beyond the second ring, the third ring of insecurity is really the wider Asia-Pacific neighborhood, China's wider neighborhood, and in this wider region, Beijing's goal is to establish and maintain a sphere of influence, and not completely restrict, ban outside powers from intervening, but severely limit that ability of outside powers to operate militarily and otherwise in China's neighborhood. The fourth and final ring is the rest of the world. And historically, this has been the least important ring for Beijing, and yet it's become in recent decades increasingly important as China has more and more overseas interests. So investments, and the prime example of this would be the Belt and Road Initiative, which underscores that China has interests now all over the world. But still fundamentally, Beijing maintains a nested worldview, so they focus a disproportionate amount of resources to maintaining security and stability in the inner rings, while they recognize the outer rings are becoming increasingly important and require greater attention and resources. So there's only one country in the world, from Beijing's perspective, that can reach out and touch China or hurt China in all four of those rings. And there's no prizes for guessing which country that is. It's the United States. And from Beijing's perspective, yes, there's definitely a hard power threat that the US poses to China in other words, in military terms, in economic terms, in technological prowess. But that's not the full extent of the US threat from a Chinese regime's perspective. There's also a soft power threat. And this is seen as particularly dangerous because it's about, from Beijing's perspective, a battle over ideas. Political ideas about human rights, democracy, and part of that threat is U.S. support for groups within the first and second rings of China's nested conception of the world. But it's also about the inspiration that these ideas give, these US ideas about human rights and democracy give to dissidents and separatists, using the word that Beijing likes to use, in places like Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. Second point I want to touch on is the origins and evolution of Beijing's nuclear program. On this front, I think it's important to note that often it's often said that Beijing's highest priority is regime survival. I think this characterization is misleading, to say the least. It implies a sense of desperation and a day-to-day struggle for the regime's existence. I actually believe that Beijing is far more confident about its near-term survival, and hence it's quite confident that its muscular internal security apparatus and high-tech surveillance system is quite effective. So Beijing's not worried about the regime being overthrown or collapsing tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. They're pretty confident about the short term. What Beijing's worried about, however, is the medium to long term. And so I think a more accurate way to describe China's the regime's foremost priority is regime perpetuation. And hence they're focused on multi-year plans and strategies to ensure a future for the Communist Party, the PLA, and the PRC rule. I think a helpful way to think about, to label the leadership of this regime is as ambitious alarmists. So yes, they're worried about their regime security, but they're also extremely ambitious in terms of their goals and priorities, and they do focus on the long run. So I think that's helpful to keep in mind, and it also helps explain why, when the regime was confronted with a serious threat in the mid-1950s, helps explain why Beijing launched China's version of the Manhattan Project, fully aware that this would be an expensive and very time-consuming process. What was the threat? It wasn't the running dog or my dog that's whining in the background, if you can hear it. It was, the primary concern was the United States, and perceived, to be more specific, perceived US nuclear blackmail first on the Korean Peninsula and then in the Taiwan Strait. So the goal, even though Mao famously said that nuclear weapons are a paper tiger, and he still recognized or quickly recognized that China needed its own nuclear capability. So the third point I want to touch on briefly is nuclear strategy. Chris is going to talk about that in a lot more detail in a moment, but I think it's important to point out some elements of continuity and elements of change over the decades in Chinese thinking about nuclear things. 2 points of continuity, 2 points of change. First, Beijing has consistently focused on a relatively small but survivable nuclear deterrent. And that's been pretty consistent. A second point of continuity is the rhetorical commitment to a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. As far as two key elements of change, one is the concept of deterrence. And originally, this was a dirty word in Beijing's view. It was a symbol of how other more powerful countries, i.e. the United States, beat up on weaker powers like China. So for many decades, Beijing did not like the word deterrence. It did not use the word deterrence. But over time, this has changed, and now deterrence has become a central part of Chinese strategic thinking about in the conventional realm as well as in the nuclear realm. But I think it's important, even though to understand this or to acknowledge this change, is to remember that there's a legacy here, an enduring legacy that perceives deterrence in a somewhat different way than we do in the United States. And I used to work, I worked for 10 years at the RAND Corporation, and the RAND Corporation has done a lot of thinking about nuclear strategy and thinking about unthinkable things, and is in large part guilty of what I call over-intellectualizing the concept of deterrence, right? When you think about deterrence, what it actually means, it means the generation of fear. It means scaring the crap out of the other guy, the other side. And I think that is still the legacy of that way of thinking about nuclear deterrence, both in the conventional realm and the nuclear realm, is important, even though keeping in mind this evolution of thinking about deterrence. The last element of change I want to mention is this concept of active defense. This has always been important, or long been important for Beijing. It used to be used primarily at the operational level. We talk about at the strategic level. The Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army adopted a strategic stance, a defensive strategic stance, but not a passive stance at the operational level. That concept of active defense remains important today, but its use, its application has shifted more to the strategic level. And it's really, honestly, I think it's unclear to me exactly what the impact is on the conventional realm or on the nuclear realm. But it's certainly, when you read strategic writings of Chinese scholars and military analysts, they talk about, when they use the term active defense, it's interpreted in a very flexible, elastic way to include the possibility of the use of preemptive strikes. Certainly at the conventional level, but I think that it's still unclear what it means, what active defense might mean in the nuclear realm. All right, I'm going to stop there and let my colleague Chris continue.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And I will go ahead to introduce Chris. Christopher Toomey is an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he focuses on Chinese foreign policy and East Asian security issues. He has led a Track 2 diplomatic engagement with China, centering on strategic issues since its inception in 2005. Chris earned his PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has conducted postdoctoral research at Harvard University. So Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks very much to the organizers. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book project, which I was thrilled to be a part of, and really kind of proud to see the results come out. I want to just pick up in, on several of the themes that Andrew, I think, nicely laid out. I want to talk a little bit about that historic backdrop, emphasize its importance, and the way it continues to kind of constrain how China thinks about nuclear strategy. Talk a little bit about that current declaratory policy, and spin out some of the emerging hints that thinking is beginning to evolve in the way that Andrew just talked about, and talk a little bit about more specifically how China sees its security environment and the way that its conventional response is starting to entangle into the strategic issue space. I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of strategic stability, kind of going back to the origin of Paul and Jim's earlier study. I think the situation in the region is likely to get much worse over the rest of this century. But just to start out kind of with this opening point on the history and the relatively constant degree of thinking about strategic issues from 1964 to, I would put it at about the early 2000s. The idea that, Mao certainly tried to reduce the importance of nuclear weapons by maintaining that assured retaliation capability. I put a lot of emphasis in my own mind on that legacy that Andrew talked about of Beijing being on the receiving end of a number of coercive threats. And that really drives a lot of their thinking, that they don't want that to happen again going forward, and thus need to develop an arsenal that kind of immunizes them from that. And if you kind of think about even into the late Cold War, there's not a lot of creative thinking in the Chinese strategic community about what else they can achieve with nuclear weapons. They have a relatively small arsenal, thought to be relatively large warheads, and that would be useful in counter value targeting against any particular adversary that might kind of threaten their interests. And then after the Cold War, a couple of big changes occur that I think are important and drive this shift in strategic thought that you have. One is the Soviet Union in the late Cold War had been the primary threat to China. And so Chinese nuclear weapons were aimed to deter the Soviets more than the United States in the late Cold War. And that only starts to change in the very waning days of the 1980s. And then the second post-Cold War change is the dramatic rise in Chinese conventional military capabilities. It really has fundamentally shifted the military balance, in particular across the Taiwan Strait, but more generally in that, second tier of Andrew's nested security interests inside what's often referred to as the first island chain. And so, part and parcel of that shift in military capabilities is a massive investment in conventional missiles as a very useful capability for China to advance its security interests, kind of given that it faced in Japan, Taiwan, and the United States, countries that had relatively advanced air forces. The cost-effective way to penetrate defenses would be with missile capabilities. So I think some of those kind of conspire to create some shifting views about how China looks at strategic affairs. And in particular, again, I want to pull back to the linkage that Andrew flagged between conventional and strategic, right? That the Chinese have really started to emphasize joint integration of the force across the different services. If we want to get into the weeds, we can talk about the reforms that began in 2015. And coupled with that is an emphasis on information technology, informationalization. It's more cumbersome in English than it is in Chinese. Now, neither the joint reforms nor informationalization, the reliance on IT to advance your conventional military forces, neither of those fundamentally centers on nuclear weapons issues or strategy. But nevertheless, they have implications for them. Increasing ISR, has some implications for your nuclear force, right? Understanding when you are under attack is a critical precondition for a launch on warning posture. And then, the reforms that have created a more joint or integrated force have moved the Chinese towards sort of a COCOM-like structure that's familiar to those in the United States, that's referred to as theater commands. And the integration that brings about includes this very important, bureaucratically speaking, element, the rocket force that maintains the bulk of China's nuclear weapons. So, while we still have adherence at a broad level to no first use, and when the three of us and Jim have attended meetings with the Chinese talking about this, we'll hear a lot about no first use, as they like to tout that aspect of their policy. So that remains kind of formally in place. But I think if you kind of look around the margins of that declaratory policy, you'll see a number of different reasons to think that there are some change underway, right? And if we look at things like the training regimens, the emerging doctrinal and definitional discussions, and some force posture developments, all of which raise questions about whether there is a shift in that NFU assured retaliation only kind of approach. I should say, and this is common to all three of our presentations, right? Dealing with the Chinese on this issue set is a real struggle to deal with opacity. There's not a lot of transparent, frank discussions about how nuclear weapon thought is developed in the Chinese context, at least compared to discussions within the West, within the British or French strategic communities, or in South Asia. When you have Indians and Pakistanis talking about this, the discussions are much more frank. So, I think there are a couple of areas to flag. One, emerging Chinese thinking about how conventional strikes against nuclear targets are viewed. A lot more pressure for early warning and how to kind of respond rapidly in response to a nuclear attack. And the way that launch on warning might be consistent with NFU, but also a new set of Chinese approaches. There's also, I think most worrisome, some discussion about how nuclear weapons can be used to deter conventional war, that nuclear weapons kind of contribute broadly to China's rise in ways that you didn't have that sort of discussion previously. And then lastly, kind of finally catching up with the United States, the Chinese are starting to talk about trans-war deterrence, or the way that war fighting within a nuclear context might occur, the old Herman Kahn ladder of escalation kind of approach. Right. So I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese have signaled in a variety of ways that conventional strikes with accurate precision-guided munitions on their nuclear force and C2, but pretty clearly on their nuclear force, would be regarded as an escalation into the strategic realm. And, that raises the question of what do you mean by use, right? If that's consistent with use, how is, what do we define use to mean? Is us taking away some Chinese capabilities, us presumably, or the Indians potentially, taking away some Chinese capabilities, does that constitute use of nuclear assets? So again, some signs that that's occurring. Again, I flagged kind of launch on warning, which raises all sorts of questions about what Chinese capabilities are in that regard and how accurate they would be to differentiate a conventional from a nuclear incoming attack. That's rife area for potential miscalculation and inadvertent escalation, and one of the reasons that I think the situation is likely to get worse. Xi Jinping talks about the rocket force as, quote, a strategic support for our country's major power status, end quote. What does that mean, right? How is the direct connection between your possession of, again, a fairly modest small force, 5% of the US warhead arsenal today. Maybe it's going to rise if the Stratcom commander's intel is correct. Maybe it's going to rise to 10% at the end of the decade, but still a fairly modest force in comparative terms. But how does that contribute to China's major power status? And discussions about deterring infringement on core interests or seizing the initiative in the nuclear realm. These are kind of new signs of evolving strategic thought. And then, this basket of trans-war deterrence, using nuclear weapons to limit war, and discussions of war fighting, right? Traditionally, Chinese rocket force, or the Second Artillery, as it was known back in the day, didn't emphasize rapid response. The sense was, so long as the response was coming at some point, right? You wanted it to be assured more than rapid. But that meant you could have slower lines of communication. You don't have this differentiation problem of not knowing what you're being warned of. You'd know whether you were hit with nuclear weapons or not. But now, when you look at exercises, they talk about really emphasizing the shortening of the transfer time. Was shortened by 2/3 compared to the previous transfer time of a warhead from a storage depot to an operational unit. Talking about similar quick reaction capabilities have been improved significantly as well. So you see that sort of language in the training. In doctrinal manuals, the few that we kind of get smuggled out, there is discussion of, quote, first strike group and the follow-on strike group of nuclear weapons. So again, that's not sort of the counter value last response after you've been hit. It's trying to reestablish nuclear deterrence or deter further conventional escalation potentially, while holding in reserve that follow-on strike group. All of this is kind of new sets of strategic thoughts. And then we're not talking a lot about capabilities today. I know all three of us, as well as the organizers, the editors of the volume, would be happy to do so in Q&A. But one aspect that has really developed significantly is increasing accuracy of Chinese ballistic and cruise missiles. And again, that raises questions about their potential role. You don't need accuracy to hold at risk a few of the adversary's urban areas in a counter value, but you do in either a war fighting or a counter force kind of posture. All right, well, so let me just kind of stop there. I want to flag just to encourage you to be as pessimistic as I am, to think through the likely trajectory along China's periphery, right, of more countries developing A2AD like missile capabilities, intermediate range anti-ship missiles, but also missiles to hold at risk, Chinese targets on the mainland. The South Koreans just got permission from the United States to extend the range of their ballistic missile force. So you're going to see more of that. The Chinese are going to inevitably respond. And I haven't even talked about cyber and space. And we all know of the importance of China's space launch capabilities as we watched satellites come down in the last couple of weeks, was it? We're thinking about that issue. That's going to be another area where the temptations to interfere in each side's space-based ISR is likely to only intensify and I think trigger dangerous potential escalation spirals that aren't centrally about nuclear escalation, but very quickly get into areas that raise those concerns. So my time has expired. Let me turn it over to Jim and to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our last speaker this morning is going to be Brad Roberts. Brad Roberts is director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. From April 2009 to March 2013, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Brad Roberts was a member of the research staff at the Institute for Defense Analyses, an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and editor of the Washington Quarterly. He has a BA from Stanford University, an MSc from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a doctorate from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Brad, over to you.
Paul, thanks so much. Thanks to both you and Jim for your leadership on this project and for the opportunity to join you today. Let me also begin with a disclaimer and just be clear that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. Please don't attribute any of my views to my employer. I was asked to get out the crystal ball and look at the future. And the first thing I did was get out my reading glasses and read all of the chapters, of course, for what they had said about the future. And one thing that leapt out at me, so Andrew has defined for us the meaning of China. Chris has brought us to the meaning of the word use. I find that I had to puzzle over our meanings of the word strategic. The authors in this volume use the word strategic to mean many different things, as we all do. Sometimes the word associates with a particular class of nuclear weapons. Sometimes it associates with all things long range. Sometimes it associates with the really important stuff that we're talking about. There are different meanings of this word. And I've been a little flexible in my own use of it. And what I'm going to do is set out 3 predictions about the future and 5 big questions. The predictions are 1, that China's nuclear force will be more capable from a military and technical perspective as it goes from being a monad to a dyad to a triad, as it acquires certain regional strike capabilities, as it acquires improved warning and command control. This will be a much more capable force, as Chris has already indicated. And moreover, the capability set is growing beyond the nuclear capabilities. Long-range strike capabilities that are non-nuclear, non-kinetic means, space-based capabilities, et cetera. China's strategic military toolkit is diversifying, and this is consistent with its pursuit of, quote, integrated strategic deterrence, a buzzword that's been in use for some time. So more capable, Second prediction, more competitive. China will be more competitive. It already has a stronger science and technology base, a growing production infrastructure, a growing capacity for military innovation. And this puts China in a much stronger place than it's been historically to be able to adapt and change its strategic posture in shorter periods of time than before. And the third prediction is that China will be more confident, already is more confident, in its ability to accept risks, military and otherwise. So 3 predictions: more capable, more competitive, more confident. 5 big uncertainties. First question, will a more capable, competitive, and confident China also become a more assertive or even aggressive China, both politically and militarily? China's experts, of course, tell us, and China's leaders tell us, that China's rise will be peaceful and that its power will be used in pursuit of a harmonious international order. Some experts in China make the case that a China that feels less vulnerable to coercion by the United States and others will be a more secure and satisfied power, willing to engage in common security measures. The bulk of the evidence so far suggests that it's probably not going to work out this way. The China that's been emboldened in part by its improving military capability has been more assertive, and this bodes ill for the future. Time will tell. Second big uncertainty, whether improved Chinese strategic capabilities will result in a significant shift in the strategic military balance with the United States, and thus also a meaningful gain in China's strategic influence. That's a big question mark, because it depends as much on what the United States does as on what China does. Secretary of Defense Austin has described China as the pacing threat for the further development of US military strategy and posture. This implies some big choices yet to be made by the United States about responding to the pacing threat. Some responses will maintain strategic balance, restore strategic stability. Others might take us in the other direction. Third big question is whether China's nuclear policy traditions, lean and effective, minimum means of reprisal, no first use, will these fade away with time? Will they in 2040 look like simple relics of a century earlier, 1940 to 2040? The traditions appear very deeply ingrained. We've both Andrew and Chris have touched on that. But as we've all heard in our informal dialogues in Beijing, they're under a lot of pressure from developments in the US strategic posture, from developments in the Russian posture, the Indian posture. The list goes on. These traditions are under some pressure, and the signs of change are already evident, of potential change are already evident, and Chris has touched on some of those. Fourth big question. We cannot know whether China's approach to military competition in the new domains of cyberspace and outer space will be guided by a notion of strategic stability, something like the one that obtains in the nuclear realm. The Chinese argue that strategic stability in the nuclear realm requires assured retaliation through the preservation of a second strike capability, a force capable of absorbing the first blow and counterattacking and reattacking as directed by political authorities. And of course, they see the development of US non-nuclear strike in combination with limited missile defense as a threat to that assured retaliation. Thus, they argue their changes to the scale of their deterrent are in the service of strategic stability. maintaining the status quo ante, the ante before developments in the US strategic posture. Is that how they think about competition in cyberspace and outer space? Are they competing to be in a stable strategic situation, such as we would understand it from the nuclear realm? Are they competing to be second to none, a shorthand we use in the nuclear business to describe competition, but not the push for supremacy? Or do they seek to dominate, quote unquote, a word that some Chinese leaders have used, as have some American leaders? This is a big uncertainty. What principle guides China's pursuit of military capabilities in cyberspace and outer space? And the fifth big uncertainty relates to 2049. When we interact with Chinese experts and ask them what behaviors do they expect of China between now and 2049, they have a story. When we ask them what to expect beyond 2049, the story gets a lot fuzzier. And there's some suggestion that Chinese experts expect that 2049 moment to be a watershed moment. And Xi's pathway to 2049 is relatively clear, but the destination is what he has called the dominant position at the center of the international system, the dominant position. This dovetails with Chris's point about the role of nuclear weapons in supporting the power of the state. So I see a mix of predictions that we can make confidently about China's strategic future, but some big uncertainties. My chapter in the book goes on to consider the drivers of alternative outcomes. And the punchline there is that, of course, from a US policy perspective, the choices in front of us are going to be significant drivers of different Chinese outcomes. By no means the sole driver, but political choices we make about the nature of the relationship we seek with China, and military choices we make about how to compete and towards what end will shape the choices China makes. Now, it may be that China's trajectory is already set, and that the changes we're seeing in the nuclear area and the space area and the cyber area indicate decisions already taken. And thus the question may be for US policy how to try to divert China from some of the choices it's already made. Time will tell if that's so. So let me thank you for the opportunity to join the discussion, and I look forward to the Q&A portion.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. For the next portion, our question and answer session, I'm going to turn it over to my protege, Anvesh Jain, who will moderate the questions. And we've got a few that have come in from the viewers over on YouTube, and then the ones that we already had in-house from the subject matter experts. So over to you, Anvesh.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you to our esteemed editors and presenters for their very interesting insights on the past, present, and future of China's strategic arsenal. As Doc said, we have a mix of questions, both from subject matter experts that we kind of had pre-selected, and some interesting ones that have just come in from our attendees. And for the sake of time, I'd like to start with those coming in from the YouTube live stream. So the first one is from Emily Tatton, and she asks, how does China see current efforts to modernize and expand its nuclear arsenal as part of its broader nuclear strategy and military doctrine? I would be interested to hear the authors' thoughts.
I can jump in, although I hope both of my co-panelists will also speak to that. And I want to kind of maybe start with the point that Brad ended on, which is there are both external and internal drivers. Let me start with the external drivers and flag US missile defense capabilities as an important one. From the Chinese view, because in their own hearts, they see their intentions as benign. And so from their perspective, they need to worry about the malign US, who supports the independence of part of China's nation state, that is Taiwan. Again, putting myself in the shoes of a Chinese leader. And allied with, the former imperialist power, Japan, and so on. So there are reasons to be worried about competition with the United States, broader competition that Andrew alluded to, for regional leadership and global affairs as well. And missile defense capabilities, while the US sees them as quite modest, the Chinese view is, well, if a war over Taiwan escalates, and somehow starts to move towards the nuclear realm, a lot of our force is pretty vulnerable. We have noisy submarines. We've heard Chinese talk about their subs as being noisy. The Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, has put out a chart that shows, qualitatively, if not quantitatively, that is the case. Those might be a vulnerable portion of the force. So there's 50 of your 100-odd warheads that might get to the United States gone. The MIRVed DF-5Bs, liquid-fueled silo-based systems, also vulnerable to attack with conventional or nuclear weapons. So there's another, call it 25, 50 warheads also gone. And then you're left with the solid fueled road mobile systems, the DF-31 today and the DF-41 tomorrow. But those are in smaller number. And if the US catches some of them in garrison, then the Chinese may be left with only a couple of dozen warheads that they think they can send towards the US. And then the small US missile defense set of capabilities looks large, right? It would allow us to potentially immunize ourselves from Chinese retaliation. So an important driver is finding ways to not be in that situation where the Chinese are vulnerable to strategic coercion by the United States over a Taiwan scenario. India has 75% of the arsenal of China. So if we're worried as China moves from 5 to 10% of our arsenal, imagine how Chinese views looking out at India are. Right, and they actually have hot wars or hot battles, at least along the Himalayas in the last few months. So those are two important external drivers. We could talk about, as Andrew mentioned, all the different countries along China's border, 14 different countries on land border, 4 of whom have nuclear weapons, and we only talked about one of them just now. But there are also those internal drivers, right? And the elevation of the rocket force to be a service that is co-equal to, at least on paper, to the Navy and the Air Force means that they're going to be pushing for additional roles and missions to achieve their interests, as well as kind of some of these broader things that I think Brad articulated nicely that I tried to pick up on as well, of Chinese interests about its position on the world stage and as a global player are certainly evolving, right? China's 4 times our population and 2/3 of our GDP. They may well want additional nuclear power commensurate with that, and so that shift in Chinese self-conception as a great power, as a global power, is another internal driver in addition to the bureaucratic point that I just mentioned. Anyhow, I'm turning it over to the colleagues to revise and correct.
I just add, not to revise and correct, but to add on. I think there's a question today about what is driving not the modernization of China's nuclear forces, but the diversification and increase in numbers. And moreover, the increase in the rate of growth. There's something different here. Modernization has been underway for decades, and in and of itself should be untroubling to the United States. We're modernizing our forces. It's the change in the force that may be troubling, and the changes in its increasing diversity and increased capability, but also its size. And I'm looking for factors that explain that. They may have to do with Chinese judgments about future developments in American missile defense and conventional strike. After all, President Trump in announcing his review of missile defense policy, said it would be our policy to provide protection against any missile fired from anywhere at any time. And we would do so by putting weapons into space for that purpose. This could have rung big alarm bells in Beijing. On the other hand, President Xi talked in 2016 about a great rise in China's strategic capabilities. In 2017, about breakthroughs in China's deterrence capabilities. And in 2020, about being in 2049 a leader in terms of composite national strength in the dominant position at the center of the world stage. That suggests to me that maybe the Central Military Commission, the usual parameters of nuclear force planning in China, are no longer the dominant factor, and that there's a political calculus, a party calculus, as opposed to a military calculus, driving the question of what's enough. Now, I don't know which explanation is true, whether what we're seeing is strictly in the service of no first use, or whether there's a new explanation related to the China dream. The evidence, unfortunately, permits both interpretations at this time.
I have nothing to add. I think my colleagues have comprehensively covered just about everything. But I'm sure I'll have something to say in answer to another question.
Thank you. And yeah, the questions have kept on rolling in. So we'll go to one from Dr. Jared McKinney of the Air Command and Staff College. To Dr. Toomey's point on how the rocket force supports China's great power status, isn't the answer by incentivizing US and Russian acceptance of strategic stability with China as normative and arms control?
I think that's a plausible, justification. It would be nice to have more discussion of that, of what exactly that means. And the Chinese have been extremely reluctant to have a formal official dialogue with the United States over what constitutes strategic stability, how they see that as being supported by some of the developments that are underway in China, and then connecting that to their great power status, right? What else is required in the future? Does that require a degree of parity to be at that same table to discuss strategic stability with the United States? That becomes less or more worrisome. So added detail about that potential point, I think, would be welcome from the Chinese side. But a great point.
Thank you, Dr. Toomey. The next question is from Balasubramanianji from the Chennai Center for China Studies, or the C3S. He asks, to the distinguished panel, how do you see the role of India vis-a-vis China? And I guess you could answer with regards to the nuclear structures as well.
Maybe I can kick things off. From an Indian perspective, they see themselves as the equal of China, or certainly a worthy rival or competitor to China in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. But the Chinese thinking about India has tended to oversimplify, to be somewhat dismissive of India. I think that's changing because India's economy has started to take off in recent decades, and of course, India is now a nuclear power. But this is Chinese thinking about India. It's tended to be not take India seriously as it might. I think tying into what Chris was saying a moment ago, my sense is that China has not fully come into grips with the changing the trends in its region and around its periphery. So it's a nuclear-wise, it's a complicated landscape, and it's quite likely to get more complicated. And so that nuclear aspect of India, I think, is starting, along with increased tensions and conflict that Chris mentioned along the disputed border, I think has started Beijing to rethink how it views India. Over.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add beyond what I've said. I'm reminded, I'm old enough to remember the post-Cold War, two major theater contingency force planning that the United States had for conventional conflicts. And I just think it's important for us to recognize that China's got to worry about something like that. They've got to worry about having enough nuclear capabilities, survivable, quantitatively large enough, so that both strategic directions, and potentially Russia in the future, will continue to be deterred from engaging in nuclear coercion against China. I think the Indian threat is increasingly openly talked about in China, and I think Andrew kind of well stated some of the reasons for that.
Thank you. I'll go back to some of the preset questions we had from our subject matter experts before returning to some of the new questions posted in the YouTube live stream. So this question is for Dr. Scoville. You write at length about the PRC's nested worldview. What role do you think that has played during the COVID crisis? And do you believe that the wolf warrior diplomacy we have witnessed over the course of the last year and a half is tied to this narrow and insecure worldview?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that I think something that I was about to say to add to Brad's comments, but I kept my powder dry, which is the challenge. I mean, you get to the question, one of the first, I think his first question, will China become more aggressive, right? So aggressive, just like deterrence, aggression is in the eye of the beholder, right? So what China thinks, what one country, in this case China, might see as simply being defensive, or resolutely protecting its interests, defending its interests, acting assertively, another country might see as aggressive. So what I'm getting at here is this misperception challenge, and I have published an article some months ago titled "Perception and Misperception in U.S.-China Relations," where I highlight the importance of this. So in a nutshell, I don't argue that perception and misperception or psychological factors explains everything or is a standalone explanation. But what I think it does do in the case of U.S.-China relations is heighten the propensity for misunderstandings and unintended escalation. And that's, and when you look at, say, COVID, this is the Chinese military, national security apparatus over the past few decades has taken has discovered a new kind of threat, right? That non-traditional security threats. And they take these things very seriously, whether it's pandemics, whether it's terrorism, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's drug trafficking. And by their nature, non-traditional security threats lend themselves to cooperation between nations, right? Because they're, and so, you go back to a number, think about a number of issues, whether it's climate change or drug trafficking, those or counterterrorism. These are areas where the US and China have found they can cooperate and have cooperated. And so in a sense, it's surprising that on one level, it's surprising that the emergence of COVID, that's an opportunity for cooperation between the US and China. And yet, as we know, it's pretty clear, it's become yet another contentious issue. And China has, the US, especially during the previous administration, intimated or explicitly blamed China for cover-ups or intentionally using the virus against other countries, against the United States, spreading it. From the Chinese side, they even some accused the U.S. Army of being responsible for starting the virus and of course, fast forward to today, the Biden administration is in the midst of a intelligence review to assess what were the origins of the COVID of COVID. Did it actually come from a food market, or did it escape from a lab? So I think this we're focused on China, but as I think Brad mentions, this is also about what the U.S. has done. And so this, going back to my idea of perception and misperception, they exist in both capitals. And that's what makes it much more challenging, whether you're trying to, seriously address and discuss issues of strategic stability, and how both sides define it. It just makes cooperation and the potential for cooperation that much more difficult. Over.
Thank you, Doctor. So we have another question for Dr. Toomey. You write that the shift in the organizational structure of the PLA has worrisome implications for the issue of nuclear use during conventional conflict, specifically mentioning the nebulous situation of the PLARF's position within the structure. Has anything that occurred in the aftermath of last year's confrontation in Ladakh between India and China provided any clarification of these matters?
In a word, no, not to my knowledge specifically. And so, I guess anything I say would be speculative, but it is hard to imagine that the forcing function of, actual combat with casualties, even if it's of the lowest tech form possible, doesn't lead to increased pressure on that theater command to think about how to manage escalation. And so we don't know what thinking that generates, but we do know that there are, rocket forces officers at each of the theater commands. And so it's hard to imagine them not being in some of those meetings. Again, I've seen nothing specific that has come out from that, though.
Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Roberts. What role, if any, do you see the Quad playing in, as you put it, safeguarding the interests that China might attempt to challenge by military means? And is there anything that this grouping can do to shape China's future choices in ways that serve the strategic stability of the United States and its allies and partners might prefer?
Well, I can't say that I follow the Quad closely because it doesn't touch directly on these questions. China's nuclear identity and roles are very much about its major power relationships, and our response is about our strategic forces and our extended deterrence protection to our allies. I can't imagine a role for the Quad in taking steps to enhance nuclear stability, or we do, as a diplomatic and political priority, seek international support for trying to persuade China to bring its transparency practices more into line with common international practice. And to the extent the Quad exerts some coordinated effort on international norms, that's a factor. But I don't think I'd be interested if Chris or Andrew sees it differently, but I don't see the Quad playing a role in this nuclear discussion much.
Well, I agree with Brad. I think, but I think where the Quad does play a role is in heightening the insecurity perceptions of the Chinese, because they see this as an alliance or an alignment of democracies. And what's their purpose? The purpose is to gang up on China from a Chinese perspective. And so while it doesn't directly touch on nuclear matters, it just raises the level of perceptions of insecurity on the Chinese part, which I don't think is a good idea. That said, just about anything that happens of this kind is perceived tends to be perceived in threatening ways by China. Over.
Yeah, I mean, the hub and spoke model comes to mind here, right? There are important strategic discussions bilaterally between the U.S. and Japan, of course, to a lesser extent between the U.S. and Australia, but not negligible. And then, with India, a more fraught relationship, but certainly one that has touched strategic areas in the past in terms of missile defense and nuclear supplier group related diplomacy. So to Andrew's point, all of that is going to be seen to be accelerated through the Quad, even if it retains a more hub and spoke bilateral basis from Beijing's perspective.
Thank you all. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go back to some of the questions introduced on the YouTube live stream. Our next one is from Andres Orozco Ramirez. Do you believe China would be a major problem to the United States because of the risks to our allies or directly to our mainland?
I'll jump in, but I think primarily the worry in the strategic realm is steady escalation from a regional conflict, and the only one that I can envision that has significant trappings of enough importance that it might tend towards nuclear signaling and shadows and potential use is the Taiwan scenario. So there, it's not even an ally, right? It's a partner. But then the threat comes, from the potential of China to hit the U.S. homeland, of course, as a way to deter further escalation in a regional contingency. Very similar to the Cold War analogy of something breaking out in Europe, but escalating. And I think this is going to put increased pressure on how the U.S. conducts extended deterrence in the region going forward.
I think Chris has hit the nail on the head. I would just elaborate just a little bit and say that in a regional conflict that over Taiwan that engages other allies in some form of the United States, they then become vulnerable to Chinese coercion and potential Chinese attack. And indeed, separating the United States from its allies and separating the allies from each other is a part of China's strategy. So let's distinguish between a threat in time of war to be attacked and the threat of coercion, which allies are subjected to. And secondly, when it comes to the vulnerability of the American homeland, let's consider also Chinese preparations for attacks on critical infrastructure early in a conflict that may not even be kinetic in nature, may be cyber, but for the purpose of slowing American power projection, making it more costly, and putting political pressure onto political decision makers in the United States. So there may be, in what we call a regional war, there may be early forms of escalation to trans-regional conflict of a potentially non-kinetic kind, but where these dividing lines begin to get fuzzy and blurry because of the nature of the technology. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting. And I know Taiwan was mentioned. This engages a little bit with our next question and also the China 2049 theme. So another question from Bala Subramanianji from the C3S. To the distinguished panel, what would be the future of Taiwan with regards to China's ambition in the region with the present capabilities that China possesses?
Andrew, do you want to?
Sure, I'll kick things off. I led was the lead in a RAND report published last year called China's Grand Strategy. And perhaps one way to characterize China's grand strategy under Xi Jinping is China realizing the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. And there is no explicit timelines for that, but going back to the discussion with 2049 is an important year because it would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, and these kinds of anniversaries matter. So if China is to have achieved, or the People's Republic of China is to achieve national rejuvenation, implicit in that would be to have completed national unification. So back in 1997, Hong Kong became a special administrative region of the People's Republic, and 2 years later, the former Portuguese colony of Macau joined them. But the major prize is Taiwan, and so this presents a challenge to Communist Party rulers who have sort of backed themselves into a corner by making Taiwan so important. This Taiwan continues to be a challenge for Xi Jinping, and whoever follows will continue to be a challenge for whoever follows Xi Jinping. There have been some controversial discussion in the U.S. and elsewhere about the past year or so, speculation about whether Xi Jinping has decided to reunify with Taiwan by 2027. The evidence suggests that there's been no actual decision along those lines, but I think that speculation highlights two things. One is that this Taiwan is a challenge, a conundrum for Beijing, whoever's in power. And the second thing this highlights is that the U.S. is involved in this, whether we like it or not. And certainly from Beijing's perspective. So this is the Taiwan issue, to be trite and state a blinding flash of the obvious. The Taiwan issue is not going away, and it's incumbent on all parties, including those on the island of Taiwan, to do what they can to manage the situation. Over.
Let me just commend some work that is forthcoming from the Naval War College on the other coast, other side of the country's China Maritime Studies Institute. They recently held I think it was 3-day, but now I've forgotten, Zoom conference, their annual study that focused on China, the state of China's preparation for invasion of Taiwan. And there were a range of views expressed, I suppose, but I think broadly, the Chinese shipbuilding has not radically shifted towards amphibious assault shipping. Instead is focusing on blue water power projection destroyers and other vessels. So there are wrinkles around that, but I think at the same time, short of a successful amphibious invasion, China has substantial punishment capabilities that Taiwan can do very little about except accept. And so that really complicates the U.S. involvement in the region, because there's nothing or little we can do once the missiles start flying.
Okay, and I think that leads us to, I'll ask one more question and then we can wrap it up for the day. So this is again from Balasubramanianji from the C3S. China has effectively created an A2AD in the South China Sea and the first island of defense strategy. How do you see this?
I think that's right. And I think given the technology of the day, the United States needs to, and we are, engage in some pretty serious rethinking about how we deploy power, project power in the region. And I think all the services are making moves in that regard. I think the Marines have been most nimble and most far-reaching. But I think A2AD can be played by a variety of militaries. The Vietnamese have made that decision long ago and have capability. So I think that characterization is true, and the beginning of the story, not the end of the story of kind of security rivalry in the region.
I would just add a brief footnote, and that's that we should bear in mind that as China develops its A2AD capabilities, which it doesn't, of course, call A2AD, that it's casting a slight nuclear shadow into that posture, which is to say, some of the new theater range missiles are understood to be capable of delivering both either a conventional or a nuclear warhead, and part of that is just to make us ponder what might happen and to induce our restraint. And this, so the A2AD topic does contact the nuclear topic.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, I think this concludes our question and answer section. Thank you to everybody who contributed from the YouTube live stream, all of our attendees, and of course, thank you to our authors for answering those questions right away. And I'll turn it back over to Doc now for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Anvesh. Before I get going, I just want to say thank you to everybody. And also, Paul and Jim, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just to thank you too for providing this opportunity for us. And it was a good session. I appreciate all the questions that people asked.
Jim, you have anything? No? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and conclude then. A fabulous session, as Paul had mentioned. On behalf of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs and the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, I would like to thank all our presenters for joining us today to offer their keen insights into the topic of China 2049 and their book, China's Strategic Arsenal. Be sure to follow the link in the chat feature to order your copy. I would also like to thank the consortium's Anvesh Jain and Emilio Jason Angeles for their tremendous help in organizing this event and for orchestrating the live feed, social media, and question and answer portion of the show. We could not have done this without you guys. Also, the summer issue of the journal launched this morning, so be sure to visit the JIPA website for more than 450 pages worth of new content, including articles from General Kenneth Wilsbach, Compact AF, Lieutenant General John T. Thomas, Deputy Compact AF, and Lieutenant General David Crum and Colonel Matthew Nicholson, Commander and Deputy Commander of 11th Air Force, along with a host of other articles from military leaders, academicians, and think tankers from throughout the Indo-Pacific, including the first articles from the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. Finally, thank you to our audience for their attendance, interest, and constructive questions. Please provide us with feedback on the event through the LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter feeds associated with the journal and the consortium. Until our next event, thank you and have a great day.